YouTube is live. Ay. Wonder. Okay. Ugh. Okay. Okay, my friends. These days, it seems like every hour something happens that has never happened before. Everything is unprecedented. Nobody knows what's going on. Apparently, there's a website called Is It Canceled Yet? To find out what has been canceled already. My kid's school has not been canceled yet. Almost every other school has been canceled. My kids are in high school. Our hearts are really going out to people with young children. This is not an easy situation. So really, let's think about to ourselves, how can we be of help to our communities? People need our help now. I mean, everything is unprecedented. No one knows what's going to happen next. This is really a time where it's necessary to pull together. Nina was saying earlier, you know, what are we learning? Generally speaking, we don't control the world. We don't have it under control. We really don't know what's going to happen next. The rug can be pulled out at any time. This is a good reminder to all of us how dependent we are on the blessings of heaven. We really are dependent. We must never take a normal day for granted. And if nothing else comes out of this, but that we learn to take a normal day as something we should be grateful for, then that is a valuable lesson. Tonight's learning is dedicated by Spencer Ehrman to the memory of his mom, Dorit bat Zelig HaCohen v'chana. May the learning that we share together tonight redound to the credit of Spencer's mom, to Dorit bat Zelig HaCohen v'chana. May her neshama, her soul, have a great elevation. And the fact that we're learning in her honor, that her name in this world, even when she's in the next world, is associated with Torah learning that's extending out not over across America, across our continent, but even internationally and between continents. May her merit be great, and may her soul have a little extra lift in the next world. Remember, as we were speaking about, it was yesterday, when we were talking about our portion in the world to come, the Jewish idea of the soul's destiny in the next world. It's not binary. It's not, heaven or hell, good or bad. There's many, infinite different levels of places where you can end up. And we have a very firm and long-standing tradition that when learning, Torah learning goes on in this world, in the name of, in the memory of somebody who has gone on, it lifts them up. It does good for them in the world to come. The other souls look to that soul and say, wow, that's amazing. There's people thinking of you and learning in your honor, and they elevate that person, and they come a little closer to the divine presence and enjoy more radiance and learn themselves at a higher level in that world. It is a great good. This is available. We are in the period of our annual fundraiser. Normally we gear up for a 24-hour fundraiser that was scheduled to be at the end of March. We're starting to reconsider. We think we may do a sort of rolling fundraiser, rather than try to psych everyone up for an exciting celebratory 36-hour, 24-hour fundraiser. It may be done more as a rolling fundraiser. And one of the ways that we'll do that is people can dedicate one of these classes in somebody's honor, in the honor of, or in the memory of. If that's something that you would like to do, send us a private message and you can sponsor a class and dedicate it in somebody's honor and help our enterprise reach more people with more Torah. We reach a lot of people, but everything, takes resources. and we're a nonprofit, and we need support from viewers like you to make this happen. We are holding by Daf Zion, page 7 of Tractate Shabbos, the second tractate of the Talmud. We have been elaborating on the Mishnah that is prohibited to transfer from a private domain to a public domain or vice versa, but that it is not simple. What constitutes a transfer? You need a lifting, a transferring, and a placing. And likewise, in a public domain, you can't lift, carry 4 cubits, and place. And if you do all 3 of those actions, lift, transfer, and place, or lift, carry, and place, then you're liable, and you did it unknowingly, unwittingly, because you didn't know it was Shabbat or you didn't know it was illegal, then you become liable for a sin offering. And so we're wondering, what are the cases when a person is liable for a sin offering? And we've been defining all the elements that bring about that liability. And we're really breaking our minds on this because these rules are not easy. But this is the kind of Talmudic training that makes Talmudic scholars sharp, right? It's going to make us sharp. And the idea philosophically is that by sharpening our minds, we're going to be able to understand, what is God's will for us? How do we do things properly? How do we do things righteously? Underlying everything that we're studying is really a beautiful, beautiful notion that God didn't just create the world and hold the ultimate power over everything, but also that God is good and that God wants us to be good and to do good. We should never just, rush past that assumption. It's a huge, huge given that we take. We know that because God appeared to us and gave us the 10 commandments, and we can see in the commandments, we innately understand that they are good and that they are for our good and that inspire us to do good, right? So now we're learning how to observe the Shabbos. Observing Shabbos is one of the 10 commandments for a Jew. And so how do we observe Shabbat? There are 39 categories of forbidden labor. We cannot engage in this kind of creative labor on Shabbat. That's part of guarding the Shabbat, right? We sanctify Shabbat. That's what we do actively. And we refrain from doing work on Shabbat. That's the negative commandment of Shabbat. But to understand what are all the forbidden labors, they're related to the construction of the tabernacle in the desert. And the 39th of the 39 labors, this is where we start our study, is that you can't transfer from the private domain to the public domain or vice versa, and you can't carry in the public domain. So let's get started with this page. We have the case of a field that is surrounded by a fence. A field can be small or it can be large. This field is going to produce a minimum of 2 sa or se'ah of grain. This is a measure. It's a volume. A mikvah contains 40 sa of water. So you can imagine a mikvah has to be big enough for a person to dunk in. It's a specific measure. I can't really transfer it into liters or gallons, but a mikvah is a good size hot tub, right? that comfortably a person can get in and dunk in. That's 40 sa. So this is a field that's going to produce at least 2 sa of grain, and it could be much larger, okay? So what we have is the case of a field. It's private. It's a private domain because it is owned by a farmer, right? He owns the field. He grows grain there. It's big enough to at least produce this much grain, so it's private. But even though this fence has partitions around, this field has partitions around it, has a fence around it, it's a clearly delineated field, therefore it is a private domain, and one would incur liability to the sin offering if he took an object from the public domain and threw it into this field because it's a private domain. Nevertheless, the rabbis instituted a stringency about that field that by rabbinic prohibition, you can't carry an object within the field more than 4 cubits. That's normally a restriction of a public domain. In the public domain, you can't carry something more than 4 cubits on Shabbat. Inside your house, you can, right? You can carry a book from the living room to the dining room. It's no problem inside your house. You're in a private domain. You can carry more than 4 cubits. Why, in a field that can produce at least this much grain, 2 sa of grain, why is it that the rabbis forbade carrying? Basically because it looks like a public domain, right? And so they're not calling it a public domain. It remains forbidden to transfer from the public domain into that field, and you incur liability for it. But they're going to adopt the stringency of the karmelis. The karmelis is that area which is significant. It's not small. It's not so small that it's a nothing, an exempt area. It's big enough to be significant, but it is neither public nor private. And in a karmelis, you can't carry more than 4 cubits, 4 amos. And they're going to adopt that stringency in the field because it looks like a public place. And if you were walking by and you saw somebody carrying on Shabbat in what looks like just an outdoor area that you think it might be a field, but it doesn't look like a field. It just looks like an outdoor area. And so because it's like an outdoor area that resembles a public place, they're going to adopt the stringency of you can't carry there, lest people come to carry not just in the field, but beyond the field, right? So it protects people. That is literally a fence around the Torah. Why a field? Why do we say that it's minimally the size to adopt this stringency? Because if it's smaller, if it's a field that will produce less than 2 sa or se'ah of grain, then we wouldn't adopt this stringency. Then the fence would be clearly marked around it. This is a field, remember, with a fence around it, and we would get that's a private area. Why 2 sa? This is approximately the size of the courtyard of the tabernacle, right? So the courtyard of the tabernacle where the sacrifices were brought was about this size, and it's roughly something like 40 meters by 40 meters, right? It's pretty big, actually, to produce at least this much grain. Okay. Now, if such a field were surrounded by houses, okay, so then it would be clearly a private area, and people would be allowed to carry in it. So if it's a courtyard, right, a courtyard can be large, but if it's clearly enclosed and surrounded by houses, then it's clearly a private domain, and then you could carry in it. What about the corner of a plaza? Why isn't that just a public domain? Because nobody uses the corner. The corner starts to become like a separate area that people avoid or don't really use properly, and somebody might come to store stuff in the corner, even though it's public property. People kind of can start to take ownership of a corner, and it starts to behave a little like a private domain. So the rabbis say the corner adjacent to a public domain, the corner adjacent to a plaza, is a karmelis, right? It has those features that it's neither public nor private domain. If you throw an object in a public place, in a public domain, if you throw an object more than 4 cubits, that's like carrying. Like you caused that object to move, you picked it up, you transferred it a distance more than 4 cubits, and then you placed it. It landed in the public domain. So then you're liable for violating Shabbat. You're liable to the sin offering. But if it landed in the corner or another area that's sort of distinct from the public domain, let's say it's more than 3 handbreadths above the ground. Below 3 handbreadths is just the ground. But it's less than 10 handbreadths above the ground, and it's a significant place. It's 4 by 4. So then it's a karmelis, 4 by 4 handbreadths, as we discussed yesterday and the day before. If you throw into a karmelis, so then you've transferred from a public domain into this thing called a karmelis, which only exists by the rabbinic definition. It's neither a private domain nor a public domain. You throw it into that, you have violated a rabbinic prohibition, but you are not liable to the sin offering. And this brings us to a Mishnah. If you take a ball and you throw it up in the air, and for some reason it doesn't come down, right? It never lands, but just stays in the air, it suspends, hangs in space. So then you picked up, you threw, but it was never placed. So you would not be liable for the sin offering. In fact, you haven't done anything. So you would be that is not a prohibited action even by rabbinic decree. Well, I take that back. Rabbinically, you can't pick up in the private domain in order to throw something. You started an action that could result in liability for violating a biblical prohibition. So I'm sorry, you can't do that. That's rabbinically prohibited. But if it never landed, then you definitely are exempt from bringing the sin offering. You did not violate the biblical prohibition. What do you mean it never landed? Okay, that's pretty unlikely that for some reason it would just hang in space. But what if you threw it up in the air and it landed on a wall, right? So if that, and that wall, of course, is higher than the 10 handbreadths above the ground. Now, if the area at the top of the wall was more than 4 by 4 handbreadths, so then it would be a private domain. It's significant because it's 4 by 4, about 16 inches by 16 inches, and it's more than 10 handbreadths above the ground. That would be a private domain, and you would have transferred from a public domain to a private domain. But if it is less than, if it's less than 4 by 4, then it's a karmelis, and then you are exempt from the biblical offering. And this brings us to a very unusual case that the rabbis imagine, and maybe could even exist. So now we have the case of a house that's like a dollhouse. It's like a mini house inside, right? So we have a house, and the funny thing about this is, if you saw the movie Parasite, it actually starts to suggest this house, which is really used as a hypothetical case so that we understand the law, but it could exist. So if we have a house that the interior of the house is less than 10 handbreadths high, right? So a handbreadth is about 4 inches. This is a house that the inside of it is less than 40 inches high. I mean, it's like a foxhole. It's like where soldiers would, kind of like huddle with their guns sticking out the window. Maybe that's when you would have such a situation. Or, it's like a pup tent, right? It would be that kind of a situation. It's so small inside. Because the interior is less than 10 handbreadths high, that interior, it's a covered house. It's covered, it has a roof, so it's a house, it has an interior. But because it's less than 10 handbreadths high, it's not considered a private domain. It doesn't amount to a private domain. But if that roof, which is above this mini house, right? It's inside, it's only like 39 inches high. You have to walk around like on your knees. But if the roof above this house is at least the 10 handbreadths above the ground, where the ground is a public domain, then the roof of that house is a full-fledged private domain. You can carry as far, more than 4 cubits. You can walk and carry around there. You cannot transfer from the ground, which is the public domain, up to the roof, which is a private domain. Got it? The whole thing is we're avoiding making a transfer from public to private or from private to public domain. This house, which is interior, does not amount to a proper private domain. So it's a karmelis inside. If you transfer from the public domain to the inside of the house, you are exempt from the sin offering for violating a biblical prohibition. You would only be violating a rabbinic prohibition. However, you can turn the inside of that house into a proper private domain if you dug a hole in the middle of this house, right? This mini space that's only 39 inches high, approximately, inside the house, but you went to the middle of the floor, you dig a hole, right? and then you're gonna, and the hole has to be, at least a tefach deep, a handbreadth deep, maybe a few handbreadths deep. It has to be 4 by 4. Okay. So now in the middle of this house, you have something that's more than 10 handbreadths high, right? The interior space here is that minimum height of 10 handbreadths. So in there, you're a house. It's a house, right? It's like, you can't fully stand up, let's say, but it's more than the minimum measure the minimum requirement of the 10 handbreadths. So that makes the area above the hole a proper interior. It has a roof over it. It's at least 10 handbreadths high. That's a private domain. You would be liable to the sin offering if you transferred from the public domain into that area defined by the hole in the ground. Now, what's interesting is having that hole in the ground and the area above it be 10 handbreadths, even if it's a small hole in a very wide house. Like imagine that the house, is 50 feet by 50 feet, just with this tiny low ceiling. Wasn't there Being John Malkovich? You guys remember that movie? In Being John Malkovich, there was like a floor between floors with a very low ceiling. And it's sort of like that. So it's a wide floor. None of it would count as a proper private domain because the ceiling is too low, but because there's a hole dug out in the middle of it, that makes it a proper interior there. And then all the rest of it gets the status of an interior of a private domain under that roof. Why is all of it now a private domain, even though only the area above the hole in the very middle of it have the minimum required height? Because the whole rest of it, and by the way, just so you can imagine a little better, if you could see that image, that's what we're talking about, right? So the hole is in the middle. The ceiling is too low for it to be a proper private domain all around. But what happens is that all the other area around the hole in the ground comes to be regarded like a cubby, right? They call it holes, but it's a hole in the ground, and now all the rest of it is like a cubby in a wall, right? And all that cubby space, right, where you could stand in that hole in the ground and have enough height for the minimum height. And now you could stick your stuff around you, and it's all like sort of storage spaces that are part of the house, where the house is defined by having that minimum required height only in that little hole in the ground in the middle of it, right? So that's how we come into this idea of holes having the same status as the house that they're in, right? So now you can imagine the closets of a house, or if you have cubbies in the wall that have cabinets and you can open the door, right? Like what's the status, even though it sticks out into the street, but you access it from the interior, the space in that cubby, it has the same status as the house. It's a private domain, right? Or like a bay window, right? So if you have a bay window that sticks out of a house, it's like it's protruding out into the public domain, but it's a hole of the private domain, a cubby of the private domain, and so it has the status of the private domain. This brings us to the question of, what about in a public domain? Imagine, for example, that you're at the Western Wall, okay, in Israel. And so that's definitely a public domain, right? Thousands of people go through there every day. And now there's like nooks and crannies in the wall, right? So if you stick something in the nook and cranny, what about that nook and cranny? That little nook in the wall. What is its status? Is that the public domain? So this has there's a dispute between Rava and Abaye. So Abaye says that a cubby in the public domain, a hole in the wall in a public domain, has the same status as the public domain. The whole is a public domain, just like the public domain. So if you transferred something just from public domain to public domain, you haven't done anything. You haven't violated any prohibition. It is permitted, right? if you throw something and it goes more than 4 cubits and lands in that hole, so then you are liable to bring a sin offering because you carried in the public domain, you picked up, you threw it more than 4 cubits, it landed in a hole, and according to Abaye, that hole has the same status as the plaza that you're in. It's a public domain too. But Rava says that if it's a small hole, a little hole, okay, it has the same status as the public domain. But if that hole, if that cubby is 4 by 4, right? That's the minimum area to have a significant place. That's what we've been learning for several days. 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, right? That's 4 handbreadths. That's about 16 inches, 4 inches each, by 4 handbreadths, so about 16 inches by 16 inches. Now that place, that cubby in the wall, let's say, is more significant. If it's a 4 by 4 area, but it's less than 3 handbreadths off the ground, then it's just part of the public domain. Anything that's less than 3 handbreadths off the ground is considered like being on the ground. If it's between 3 handbreadths off the ground and 10 handbreadths off the ground, and it's at least 4 by 4, so that's a karmelis, neither public nor private. If it's 4 by 4 handbreadths and it's more than 10 handbreadths above the ground, what is it? Have you learned by now? Are you starting to get it? It's a private domain, right? That's a private domain. So if it had something that is at least 4 by 4 handbreadths and has a wall around it that is at least 10 handbreadths high, or that area, which is 4 by 4, is 10 handbreadths higher than the ground of the public domain, or 10 handbreadths lower than the ground level of the public domain, then it becomes significant and separated, and it is its own private domain. And if you transfer into it, you are liable, right? So according to Abaye, if you threw into it, right, if you threw more than 4 cubits, you would be liable for carrying. But if you just placed something from the public domain into a hole alongside the public domain, you didn't do anything because you went from public to public. But according to Rava, and we follow Rava, if you place something from the public domain into that cubby and it was between 3 and 10 handbreadths above the ground, then it's a karmelis. You're exempt from the sin offering, but you're liable for having violated a rabbinic prohibition. And if it's above 10 handbreadths above the ground and you transfer something into it from the public domain, then you're liable to bring a sin offering because you violated the biblical prohibition of transferring from public domain to a private domain. And if you threw something into that hole, so then you violated 2 prohibitions, you transferred from public to private, and you carried more than 4 also because it was placed more than 4 cubits away, so you violated transferring and carrying. Get it? These rules are hard. We're breaking our teeth on them, but gradually we're starting to get that rhythm, right? Gradually we're starting to understand that in order to know whether we have violated a law and are liable to bring a sin offering, and that only happens when the temple is standing, right? But understanding whether we violated it or not allows us to sharpen our understanding. When we were in Brachas, the first volume of the Talmud, was much more about getting that closeness to God and learning how to pray and to pray properly and to have a proper, mindset of submission and devotion. Now that we're in Shabbos, now the sages are encouraging us to sharpen our minds and to be able to take a question and break it down into its component parts, right? That's what this is all about, is when we face a tough problem, we say, okay, well, what are we dealing with here? And when we sharpen our minds in this way, so we'll be able to deal with tougher situations that come up. not only are we violating, a difficult to understand law and all its implications, but even when we're just facing tough situations in life. What job should we take? What school should we send our kids to? Should we enter into a contract or not? We won't be so intimidated by complex situations. We're just going to learn to break it down into its elements and inspect one aspect of the question at a time. I'm going to check the comments to see if we have any questions. I know it's a little late. I know we're all exhausted from all of the stress that has been inherent in these days of unprecedented public actions. Every day we hear crazy news. Every day something is happening that has never happened in our lifetimes. So okay. So we're not going to panic. We're going to take it one day at a time. We're going to inspect the situation one day at a time. And because we're going to face so many novel situations, we're going to have to ask new questions. Tomorrow's Friday night. It's Shabbat. Are we going to go to services? Right? Even if we're not Jewish, are we going to go to gathering places? Okay, they've shut down the stadiums. There's not going to be March Madness. But are we going to go to a church service if we're Christian? Are we going to go to a restaurant? Where are we in this coronavirus crisis? What is the information that is coming in? Learning how to face a question, break it down to its component parts, say, well, if we did this, then we do that. Understanding, problem, consequence, assumption, consequence, breaking it down is fantastic training for our minds. And may we all learn to be grateful for every normal day that we have. And may this learning that we're doing together bring Spencer Ehrman's mom, Spencer Ehrman has dedicated this class to the memory of his mom, Dorit bat Zelig HaCohen V'chanya. May her soul, her neshama, have a great aliyah, have a great elevation in the next world. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. The learning will be earlier. These days are tough. We couldn't get to it until late tonight. Tomorrow will certainly be earlier because Shabbat is coming in tomorrow afternoon. So with God's help, this class should be going between 11 and 12 Pacific. That's going to be the target time. Wishing you all the best, my holy brothers and sisters.